All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to ESM Prep's Summer SAT ACT Prep webinar. Um, we're excited to talk about this and make sure all your students are ready and willing to get ready for these fall tests and make sure they use their summer well. So first kind of step. So our presenters today are going to be me, Brian Smith. I'm a senior academic mentor at ESM, and Edmund over here. Let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Edmund, and I also tutor test prep, same thing with Brian, and I do math as well.
So today, just a quick overview, and mostly we're going to be focusing on is summer prep, but here's the agenda. So we got first couple little terminology things to go over in our first couple slides. First, we're going to be discussing fall SAT, ACT registration, how to get signed up for that, and all that opens up. Then we're going to go through the various test policies and make sure everyone is really familiar with this kind of terminology. Then we will start kind of like the main point of the presentation, which is of course summer test prep. We're going to go through like what we kind of recommend for preparing in the summer, what the test prep timeline looks like, our advice for like individual sections, and then we're just going to talk general advice for parents as well. And then of course we'll end with some Q&A. So the Q&A isn't necessarily for the end. Feel free to, of course, at any moment type your questions into either the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll answer those when we can.
Compile it all at the end.
Yeah, we will have a dedicated section to kind of hit those at the end. Okay, so first thing, getting registered for these tests. So currently, registration for the fall and SAT and ACT test has not opened yet. SAT registration is supposed to open up in early July. It's a quotation marks because that's all we really know at the moment. We have no specific dates. We just know that it's early July. Whereas ACT registration, it says July there, but we now know it's mid-July. It's kind of their latest update. Yes, just a little bit more specific, just a little more helpful, I guess. And we want to make sure everyone is aware of this because, there's always a rush for getting registered for these tests. And so we want to make sure that everyone gets registered for any and all tests as soon as possible. The good news is that when these registration opens up, they open up for all dates. So it's not just for like the August and September dates. It's for pretty much any dates that are upcoming. On the side here, we have a list of the upcoming ones. We have an August SAT, October, November, December, and then September, October, and December ACTs. There is also an ACT in this coming July. Registration deadline for that is this week. So if the students plan on taking that, make sure you get registered as possible. That said, there aren't too many spots open for it, so it's probably tough to find a spot at this point. But yeah, the main thing is be ready to register as soon as you can. Those spots fill up pretty quickly, especially if you want to get a spot close to you. It's really important that you register as soon as possible. The other big thing we want to make sure everyone is aware of when signing up for these tests is what we call the QAS and TIR options. Essentially, these options are the same thing. Basically, what they provide is that when you buy it, the student gets a copy back of the full test along with their answers. So if that test is available, if the QAS is available or TIR available on that date, we want to make sure that you sign up for them. It is not available on all dates. For SAT, it's just available on the October date. For the ACT, it's just available on the December date. So do prioritize those dates if you can, because those are dates where we can kind of get like the full test back as well. For SAT,
it's not deal breaker. So like, even if you can't get it, you should still register and take it, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, please take the earlier test. Like, yes, it's just if it's available, do sign up for it. One other quick note here, do not confuse the QAS with the SAS, which is the student answer service for the SAT. The SAS is available on every date, but it's not super helpful because it just tells students what questions they missed, but doesn't give them the actual questions. So that is not really worth like paying a little extra money for. The QAS or TIR, those are worth it. The SAS is not.
That just like basically gives you your raw score, which.
Right. And yeah, it's just not super helpful or anything. The last kind of note we wanted to hit on here is cancellations. So for this last kind of round of testing in June, the situation was definitely better. It was much better than it is in spring. We still had a decent amount of cancellations, I would say, for both ACT and SAT. With ACT, we saw a couple last minute ones, though those are always more logistical issues rather than COVID ones. But we do expect the situation, since it is generally improving in the US, to be hopefully pretty close to back to normal, and hopefully cancellations will be a thing of the past. We don't know, obviously, but at this point, we do want to make sure you're aware that it is still a possibility, it is still a thing that could be dealing with. But we'll just have to see. But for now, just focus on getting your student registered for all dates that are available, pretty much.
Yeah. And a quick reminder that when you register for these, pretty much don't have to do the essay anymore. In fact, SAT doesn't even offer it anymore. Also, right, there's no more subject tests. So just some of the advice that you might have gotten maybe even less than a year ago would not apply anymore. So make sure you just
yeah, and like even the ACT essays, like you can still take it, but it's not really, doesn't add much value, if any, to a college application. So we usually don't recommend students take up a lot. Okay, so before we move on, Deepika asked up to how many times can a student take the SAT, ACT? The answer is as many times as you want. Realistically, we don't recommend students take it. We find most students tend to take the test anywhere from 2 to 4 times. 3 to 4 is generally the most common. But you can technically take it, not an infinite amount, I think. There's some cap, I think, for the ACT, but it's something like 12 or something like that. Yeah, like anyone gets there. But in terms of what colleges care about, they don't put an upper limit on it. I would say, like, though, if the student has clearly plateaued, it's not a good idea to keep taking tests and just kind of getting the same score over and over again. That doesn't look good to colleges because it shows that the kind of student isn't really putting any work to improve or anything like that. Right? Any add on for that, Edmund?
Yeah, same. I would say, there is a cost that comes for it. I mean, aside from the the registration fee and all that stuff, but just time, right? Like the time that you spend taking like your 5th test, you have to wonder whether that time could have been better spent, working on your personal statement, or if it's not taking away from an extracurricular activity. So definitely, I would say, yeah, unless you're making huge strides, and that's what practice tests are for, right? You basically should have a very strong idea what your test score will be before you take the test, because the practice tests do a pretty good job at being standardized and all, predicting what your score will be.
Absolutely. And then for a little more specific advice for seniors, I would recommend they sign up for just all these tests. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to take it. They can always cancel later, but you want to have the option just in case. You do want to be mindful of is that some of these dates are definitely pushing like past like when colleges will accept them. The August and October days are usually fine, but November and December start kind of getting past like when colleges will accept those dates. For juniors, I'd probably recommend like 2 to 3 fall tests are generally a pretty good idea to kind of hit for. You don't necessarily need to do all of them, but 2 is a pretty good start, I would say. Okay. All right, Evan, take it away.
All right. So when it comes to test policies, these things have changed a lot as well for various colleges. Many colleges during the the coronavirus pandemic have now gone test optional, right? Which basically means that students can submit scores if they want to, but they don't have to. They'll still consider the application. Now, that's a big difference with test blind. I would say test optional is pretty controversial because it's hard to say that, like, okay, if I'm comparing an application that has a test score with an application that doesn't have a test score, I mean, like, we don't really know how they're doing that, right? So, and we're of the opinion that, still, if you have a strong test score, that can only help your application. So even though they say it's optional, I mean, if you have, the time and the means and the talent to get a strong test score, it's pretty much required. Now, as opposed to test blind, right? These are schools like the UCs that have recently adopted this policy that they won't even consider your test score. That is then, the true, test blind, right? That this is not a factor in applications. you can safely apply without a test score and not have to worry about, getting dinged somehow or having them assume that, the equivalent of like, taking a class pass, no pass means that you got a C or something like that, right? They're not, there isn't that. That being said, there are still some schools that are requiring tests. So you're just gonna have to research individually and make sure. In terms of early decision, early action numbers, we can see that there is, there are still students who are submitting, right? So scores that are for schools that they are doing early decision on. 19% for UPenn compared to just 9.8 that did not submit scores. So still pretty competitive in terms of test scores as a way to make yourself stand apart.
Sounds great. So yeah, broadly speaking, the advice is take the tests, right? Because at least like worst case, you still have the option to choose whether you want to submit it or not when it comes to application time, right? If you don't take the test at all, then you don't even have that option to submit later or not, maybe if you want to. It totally depends on the application. The only time we would say like, you definitely don't need to take the test if the student is 100% sure they're only going to apply to schools like UCs or CSUs. 100% sure.
Yeah.
If there's any possibility that they could apply to any of those schools, you gotta take the test.
Yeah, I mean, that again, to highlight, this is a huge discrepancy, right? Between, 19% at mid rate versus 10%, that's basically double. So, they say that they don't show preference, but the numbers tell a different story, right?
Yeah, it can be difficult to figure out. Okay, so now on to our main topic, summer test prep. So here we just kind of want to give an overview of the process and kind of give like basic or general recommendations for what to go about it. So the first step, as always, is start with a diagnostic. This, no matter what time of the year and wherever and whenever you're starting prep, this is always your first step. And technically, we almost say start with diagnostics here, right? We want you to do one with both the SAT and the ACT, because that is the first step of like picking a test, right? Taking a diagnostic, getting used to kind of the differences between both tests. We're not going to talk about that much here, but that is definitely like kind of like your first step. Ultimately, you kind of want to make the decision simply based off which test feels better for you and which one do you kind of feel like you can improve on, right? Colleges do not differentiate between the two. It ultimately is just whichever one feels better to you. So once you kind of create it, you've taken your diagnostic. Now you want to analyze your diagnostic, right? You want to figure out like what you did wrong, what your mistakes are, and what you kind of need to do and improve, right? And so based off of that test, this is kind of the most important thing, right? We want to create and of course maintain structure. So what does that mean? It means consistency, right? Do not go about your prep randomly. Like don't be like, oh, I'm going to do like 5 minutes of English on Monday and then 20 minutes of science on Thursday and then just do something completely different the next week, right? Make it structured, make it specific. So I'll say something like on Mondays from like 2 to 3 p.m. I'll do an hour of math or something like that. And then on Tuesday, it'll do an hour of English or other thing like that, right? Something just to make it consistent and actionable, right? Something that you can tell like whether you're improving on and you're making consistent progress here. Consistent and continued effort is what is really important to improving on these tests, especially when you have this time available in the summer. Have anything else to offer on creating structure?
Yeah, because if you have that scheduled, that's going to let you stick to, that's going to make you still put in the test prep on days that you don't really feel like it, because that's just something you do now. Anyone who's just try to just like go to the gym whenever they feel like it, like it doesn't work out really, right? You have to kind of carve out that time and say like, hey, tomorrow I'm going to go at this time. And then better yet, to prevent you from having to do that every day, you just say like every Monday, Tuesday, I go at this time. Then,
Yeah, and always at least like get started, right? Like with your plan, right? If you're just not doing it today, that's okay, but at least like maybe you don't have to do as long as you would normally, but at least make sure you get there and you can put at least like 10, 15 minutes of work in, right? Before you're like, okay, I'm just done for today. Keep that structure consistent, even if you can't maintain the full, normal plan, right? And then last kind of note for me there is, do be adaptable, right? Like if your structure isn't working for you for whatever reason, right? It's too much time or it's too little time or you're not making progress, then don't be afraid to change it, right? And like mix it up a little bit, but make sure you still have some kind of consistent structure ultimately. Right? Okay, so the next important point, this is the third bullet point, really important for summer, build grammar and math skills weekly, right? So this again is dependent on your diagnostic and where you're kind of at in the prep, but if you have like sort of big like conceptual weaknesses on the grammar and sort of math parts of the test, the summer is your best time to really hit these guys hard, right? Because during the school year, it's much more difficult, right? You already have 6 or 7 like kind of difficult classes. You're already trying to learn a bunch of information. It's really hard to learn like additional grammar and math skills on top of that. So during the summer is a great time to kind of use both like your time availability and just your mental availability to like really kind of hit these hard and fix these like deeper level weaknesses.
Yeah, and we're saying this just in case you're tempted to structure your test prep like, oh, in June I'm going to focus on reading, and in July I'm going to focus on math, and then in August I'm going to focus on grammar. Like that's what we're saying. Doesn't really work that well because yeah, you got to do the deep dive, but if you're like not letting your math skills, if you're not touching math for 2 months, like you're going to get rusty, and it's just going to like undo a lot of that work, unfortunately.
Especially if you're taking the ACT math section when there's just like so many math concepts, right? You just can't learn all that like in a quick time manner for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So really the goal
okay, so
is
next,
to, yeah, like take the time to reach what we call the threshold, which is that all of the concepts, right? And the basic strategies, and now you're just in like maintaining mode where you're treading water and keeping your skills sharp.
we'll talk a little bit more about the threshold in depth, but yeah, this is the point where like you get the point where like you get the basics down, you're ready with the timing, you feel comfortable. That kind of means you're ready to take your first like official test. That's sort of your goal, but that in mind that you think that you want to reach in summer. And so kind of that goes with it. Now, a really important point here is like don't burn your official resources too early. So what do we mean by official resources? We basically mean practice tests like released by College Board and ACT, which you can find either in the College Board Blue Book or in the ACT Red Book. They have like practice tests there. There's not too many available publicly. And like, although they sound like a lot, there's 6 ACTs and 10 SATs. That sounds like a decent amount, but you'd be surprised how quickly that goes, right? If you're doing one of those a week, they're gone in 2 months. And if you start your prep right now, that means those are gone by August, right? Before you maybe even taking your first test. So be careful with those, right? Those practice tests are going to be very valuable resources. What you should be using them for are progress tests as ways to sort of assess your progress throughout the summer. So instead of taking them like every week, maybe space it out a little bit more, like every 2 or 3 weeks, right? And these are great ways to kind of see if, to test if your structure is working, right? Have you made good progress? Have you learned those grammar and math skills? Space those out and make sure you save some for closer to the test and maybe kind of later in the process as well.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you might not even take that test one time. That's something to keep in mind too, right? You don't want to just be like, all right, well, I saved it, and now before my test day, I used all of them. Well, what happens if you don't get the score you want?
Yeah, that kind of goes into the last point there, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? Like the summer prep, this is just the beginning phase. This is the first phase of your prep, like where you would just want to get like the bulk of like the content learning out of the way. But it's not, don't expect to be done with these fall tests. Like most students take the test 1 to 2 times for the first time in fall, but usually they end up having to take double tests in the spring until they're fully done. So this is not a quick process. It can sometimes be as long as like 8 to 10 months or sometimes even longer for some people. So it's absolutely a marathon for sure. And just be patient and remember that in terms of the progress too. Progress does not come in days. Like it can maybe come in weeks, but often more times we generally measure progress in terms of months, if anything. So be patient with yourself and don't burn out. Like don't feel like you're not improving. The way this can sometimes be kind of hard to figure out, but the 2 ways you check your progress is, do I feel like I'm learning? If you're learning something, you're improving. That is, of course, relevant to these tests, then you are improving. That's kind of one way of internally measuring it. The other way is, of course, taking practice tests as a way to assess progress. Anything else here, Evan?
No, that was great.
Okay, so now go more in depth on the test prep time. And specifically, we already kind of talked about this a little bit, but this will go a little bit more in depth here. So starting point, as we kind of mentioned, SAT and ACT diagnostics, you take a full test, determine which one is the best for you. And so the summer test prep stuff we were talking about is really going to be the phase 1 and phase 2. Mostly phase 1 is really the kind of part that we were talking about that you really want to hit hard during the summer. It's sort of like this basic part while you're shoring up conceptual areas, learning semicolon rules, right? Math topics like geometry you may have forgotten, that kind of stuff. And just getting, of course, used to the basic sections and getting the timing down and all that stuff. And that gets you to the phase 2, the threshold point where you're comfortable with all that stuff and you kind of, you got the basics of the test down, and that's the point where you will see generally this is the biggest, in terms of just raw score improvement. It's from the starting point to phase 2. That's the biggest jump in terms of score. So that's kind of like your rough sort of goal. Evan, you want to talk about the fun phase 3?
Yeah. So phase 3 is just, what you have to do, right? Every time you review the test, you understand your errors, things like that, right? So now it's just a matter of making it official, right? It's like, okay, I need, and all making it official and extracting every possible point you can, right? And so, and getting every edge you can. So that's where, you're thinking more big picture. So something like, okay, I need to work on my mental stamina, right? Like before I was doing little homework assignments and it was great because I was always fresh. But what am I going to do with, on the actual test when it's ACT science, the fastest paced section, and it's at the very end when I'm tired, like, how do I train for that? Well, yeah, I mean, you're going to have to, you can say all you want about like, oh, I'm just going to, like get myself psyched up, but you have to prove it in practice before you should basically not do anything, leave anything up to chance or try anything new on test day, right? It has to be practiced in a practice setting first. So this is also where, you can phase 3, you're working on working on your mindset, right? So hopefully by now you've taken enough practice tests too that you're not feeling too anxious, like trying to get to that, like that, what I like to think of as like that right level of nervousness, right? Where you get the a little bit of adrenaline that like, boosts your performance mentally and physically, but you're not like, shaking and, having your brain shut down, right? So but that's basically it. And then just like, if you're working with a mentor, just like talking with them through the game day plan. Okay, I'm going to wake up at this time, I'm going to have this for breakfast, and this and that. Again, less stuff that's left up to chance, the more in control you're going to feel and the more confident you're going to be when you walk into that test.
Great. And I would just add on to that students who started prep for these tests, maybe already taken a test, like a couple tests in the spring, started prep maybe in the winter, spring, this is what you really want to working on during summer. This sort of like phase 3 of, again, you've already got the basics down, you've learned these concepts, and now you just kind of need to drill on these practice tests. Again, even though you're in this phase, still keep in mind that advice you mentioned earlier about don't burn through all those official resources too quickly, but that will be your main sort of resource for practicing for sure. Okay, favorite advice, my section. Okay, I'll start with writing language in English. So these sections, slightly different names, but they're essentially test the same concepts. The main advice here is start with this, right? On both tests, like this is basically grammar rules and learning that. When most students when they're first starting prep have maybe some knowledge of grammar, but not very thorough. Most students haven't really seen it at all since maybe 5th or 6th grade. It's very rarely taught in middle schools or even high schools today. So this is often both the quickest and easiest way for students to improve scores. Simply because it's just drilling, it's just learning rules, and there aren't really that many rules, right? ACT math has like tons of topics, but ACT English, the grammar stuff is not really that much. If you really dedicated yourself to it, you can, get a pretty good feel for that in 2 to 3 weeks if you have like kind of effective prep for that. So it's a great way if you're just trying to improve your score like really quickly to really focus on that. And then once you kind of get those grammar rules down, you get the basics of those sections, then you can start like, dedicating more of your time to sort of the other sections as well.
Yeah, the reason why we want you to start here early and often, like we said here, is that, I would say that this is the most consistent section, right? Like you're not worrying about like, ooh, what obscure, math rule am I going to be tested on? Or like, oh, I got a bad reading passage that bores me to tears, or, a science graph that I can't make out. I mean, the English section is really like easy to read passages, test the same rules over and over again,
I mean, not a problem for
yeah,
most people.
exactly. I would add that, there are these like problem types where they're like these editing questions where they ask you to like improve the essay in a certain way, right? And you have to really pay attention to what the goal is and what they're asking you to do. If you stray from that and you decide to like, I'm just going to choose, what I feel like is the best, and you make up your own goals, you're not going to have a good time. So
those are the ultimate like learning how the test works questions, right? You just kind of got to learn the logic of the test and stick to that as close as possible. Yeah, absolutely.
okay, for the math section, I think our biggest tip here is, yeah, sure, like, all the stuff you learned in school is going to be useful, but, ironically, we're also going to, we would recommend trying to get out of this math class mode. And what does that mean? That means like, showing all of your work line by line and doing everything like, proving everything like definitively. Like you don't have to do that on the test. Like take advantage of the fact that this is a multiple choice test. That's already different than your typical school math test, right? So you can do lots of tricks like, plugging in the answer choices instead of actually solving the equation, right? You can do stuff like eyeballing a geometric figure and using process of elimination. You know what I mean? Like stuff that like would not fly in a math class can really help you solve problems either quicker or problems that you wouldn't have otherwise known how to do and still get that point.
And this is applicable on both tests as well, SAT and ACT. They're very different math sections. They test math differently, but Edmonds Advice applies to both sections. That's kind of like why it's sort of like our favorite or like kind of most important tip here for sure. And kind of the same idea with reading sections as well. The reading sections are not the same. There are really big differences on both tests, but the broad advice is still the same. Like, don't overthink it, right? With reading on both tests, it's really more about like, it tests your comprehension skills. So there's that, but it's really like most important is your overall pacing and timing and just general confidence with the section, right? Don't overthink things. Like just if you're not used to this section, just read the passages and kind of go with the flow and answer the questions, right? And most importantly, don't get too hung up on something, right? On either individual questions or hard passages, right? You will get hard passages, especially on the SAT, right? Yeah. And don't let those hurt your score, right? Yeah, they might be tough, but don't let those hurt the timing. Like if it's difficult, move on. Focus on the easy stuff first. Make sure your overall pacing is good, right? Students have a tendency, especially when they're first starting off with, is to try to kind of look for shortcuts on the reading sections and kind of how to improve, right? Like, should I go straight to the questions, right? Should I just skim through the passages? And like, I'm not going to say stuff doesn't work. It varies for the students. I would say your mileage will vary is the answer to that question. But that kind of tend of overthinking and just kind of hoping for this magical fix, that's not really how these sections work for the most part. Like ultimately, if you want to improve on these, you just got to get better at reading. It's the most simple point, and that's just kind of practice.
Yeah, and to me, like keep it simple. It also means that, like the more like justification and like hoops that you need to jump through to rationalize the answer you're going to pick, the more likely that it's wrong, because these tests are actually very black and white. They say pick the best answer, but really they can't ever offer two good answers and have you like subjectively pick a better one. So it's always going to be one right answer and three wrong answers. So anytime that you find yourself like having to bring in outside knowledge or making an assumption or like about like how a character feels or something like that, it's just not a good path to go, right? Keep it simple. Is there a line that provides direct evidence for what you're about to choose? No, probably wrong. Yes, probably right. Like that's it.
Yeah, definitely. It's the way they design these tests is very easy to like argue yourself into an answer choice, right? It's a plausible answer choice, but if it's not supported by the passage, it's wrong. So yeah, great advice for sure. Then we get to everybody's favorite section, ACT Science. This one is, of course, unique to the ACT. It's a strange section. We're not going to get too into it for now. The basic, like really most important tip is do not read the initial passages in depth, right? They're there to kind of deliberately there to make you waste time and feel like you have to understand experience in depth. They deliberately put complex scientific terms. They use Latin, like scientific names a lot, and they put dense things. They tend to have like very long explanations, and you don't have time. You simply don't have time. And it's also not really what they test. What the science section focuses really on is your ability to figure out information and trends from graphs. So really, when you're first focusing on science, you really want to just focus on making sure you understand the graphs and sort of the trend within the graphs. This is a really important tip that tends to cause a pretty big boost in science scores, because when you first take it, you're treating it more like reading, where you want to read everything thoroughly, and then you inevitably run out of time, and your score is kind of lower than without having that sort of basic advice. So that's really important.
Yeah, I would say like maybe like 30 seconds or something like that, kind of skimming the passages and just familiarizing yourself with them. And then the questions, I would take them in order, because they have a certain way of like ordering the questions where they do those like easy ones first that you can just like read the graph. And as you're answering those questions, you are learning more about the passage along the way. And then when you get to the more complicated ones about like, that are more like conceptual, you're ready for it.
Yeah, it's basically only like focus on what you need to know for the questions, right? You don't need to understand the whole thing in depth for the question. Will help guide you on there for sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So don't give up on those passages. Like even when you read one, you're like, I have no idea what that is. Like you can definitely answer like those like straightforward ones that just tell you how to read a graph,
Even when you get used to these sections, it's almost every someone has to take a test. There's always like one, it's always like one test. I'm like, I just did not get that science passage, right? It was just really strange or really hard or weird graphs or something, right? And it's kind of the same advice as with the reading, right? It's just like, it doesn't matter, right? You're almost not supposed to. You don't have the time. Just focus on the data, right? It's always kind of the key. Okay, advice from parents. We've already kind of touched like on a lot of this already. In fact, I think basically everything for the most part. Register for these fall tests as soon as possible, right? It's just a headache. You just want to get out of the way. Like you just do not want to be dealing with this during the fall. It's a nightmare. Kind of the later you wait to register, the less spots that are available. The more weird it is. Just try to get it out of the way as soon as you possibly can, right? Even if you're not sure whether your student's going to end up taking the test or not, right? Like, because you can always decide not to take it, and it's pretty easy to cancel and they'll get you refunded and all that. So just sign up. If you're not sure, just sign up for it anyway. It really doesn't hurt to sign up.
Or even sign up for multiple, you know what I mean? Like if you think that you're gonna retake, and because like a lot of times if you take a test and you're gonna wait to get your score back to see whether you want to retake it, by the time you get your score back, you're not gonna get a good seat on the next on the next test date. So why not sign up for both? If you get your score back and it's great, you can still cancel the second one,
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially when you're just starting out. Like I would at least sign up for two. Like it's almost never if people want it done with this test. I'm not gonna say it never happens, it does, but it's very rarely that people get like their highest score on their first test and it's like, I'm done. I don't need to take it anymore. It's almost always at least two, if not 3 or 4 times for sure. Okay, second thing, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but stay on top of cancellation, registration changes, right? So the big thing is to stay on top of like registration opening for the SAT. Again, that was SAT is early July, ACT is mid-July, and cancellations, well, we'll just have to wait and see. But again, as I said earlier, like hopefully the situation is better in the fall. I think it will be, but we don't know for sure yet. And there still could be some cancellations here and there. I think schools will be more ready. Yeah, like they will send you emails. Just keep on top of. Yeah, make sure you pay close attention to any correspondence from either College Board or ACT. but we'll see. Still a possibility, but we're not quite out of the woods yet on that stuff. Okay, third bullet point, really important one. So if you're a parent, you're hearing us talking about this advice about encourage or about like creating structure, right? You kind of might have noticed that like we were telling the student to do that. And sometimes a lot of students simply just aren't that good at it, right? Because well, they're not used to it, right? Most students have structure provided for them. That's the whole point of school, right? And so creating their own structure is sometimes totally new to them. Um, this can be up to you and how you want to kind of help them with it, right? If you feel like the student, if you need to kind of step in and help the student, to get them started, that's fine. Help them kind of create that structure. That's fine. But I think for the most part, for most students, it's kind of best if you try out like a secondary role here, just to, try to encourage them, maybe offer them advice, but I wouldn't like force it upon them or anything for the most part. Again, definitely depends on the student, of course, but just keep encouraging and keep praising and just help them do the best they can to stick to the structure. It is hard, especially if they've never done this before.
Yeah. And then I would say, yeah, we already said to not really worry about the essays, but I mean, another thing for parents is to keep in mind that like your energy can transfer onto your student, right? So like if you're nervous about it and freaking out and like, oh my God, I mean, like that's just, that anxiety is something that, it's not going to be helpful for your kid. What they need is to be, clear about it. They need to be confident, clear-headed, and, just, yeah, be flexible. Okay, something got canceled. We'll get the next one. No problem, right? We're at the threshold. We know we got the score we want, but let's see this extra time as an opportunity to get one more point on the ACT, right? Or build a cushion or something like that. Or let's say there is you're worried about a vacation, right? You're going to go on a family trip and you're worried that, oh man, are they just going to lose everything that they've been working on? Well, no, like we can be flexible. You can find a way to carve out time to kind of help your student stay fresh on things, whether that's like like a SAT app or something like that, answering question of the day or something like that, or Khan Academy, like little pockets of time, like you could find ways to make it work, I think.
And to add on to that, I would say like my other two kind of favorite tips for parents is like, first, this is a long-term process, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not, again, you're not going to do one test and be done, right? If the first test is not great, that's okay. In fact, that's often very normal, right? It's new, you haven't done it before. Sometimes you just don't perform up to their ability on the first test.
Yeah.
Be patient, take your time, right? And to figure out what went wrong, make sure you address that for the next test and just keep working on it, right? If they keep working, they keep improving, those kind of good scores will come eventually. And so the second point, which kind of goes in hand with that last point, is that progress is not linear, right? When we start prep, we expect like progress to, go up in this straight line, right? If you start like at 23, you expect after like, 2 to 3 weeks of prep that you'll be at 25 or something like that. And yeah, that is a goal. That is what you should shoot for. But progress is much more like a jagged line rather than like kind of a straight one, right? It goes like up and down and there's peaks and valleys, right? And what we want to be shooting for is this general upward trend. There should be this upward trend. But the point is that like, on any one given test day, they could just have a bad day and then you could just hit a valley. And their second test could be worse than the first one if it's really bad. But the point is like, if you emphasize this process, you emphasize that long-term general improvement will come over time.
Yeah. And so like, yeah, I guess then just having those expectations will basically help both you and your child see the bigger picture and weather through those valleys a lot better.
Okay, so that's pretty much it. So for this last part, we'll do a little Q&A if anyone has any questions, but that will pretty much wrap up our presentation. If you guys have any more kind of specific questions to your student, feel free to reach out to an ESM staff member or mentor or counselor, and they'll be happy to discuss your student's individual situation more in depth. Anything else to add on, Evan, while we wait? Any more general stuff?
I don't know, I guess, I think we covered it mostly. I mean, it's really yeah, I mean, summer is a little tough in terms of structuring, but it's also where you have like the most free time. I would just take advantage of that.
I think so too. Okay, doesn't look like we're getting any questions, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thanks everyone for coming, and please keep a lookout for future webinars.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good one.